Hello, everyone. Welcome to a Lake Ontario evening on Indigenous treaties and peoples of Toronto. Lake Ontario evenings are part of a speaker series hosted by the Toronto and Region Remedial Action Plan, and they're always on different topics pertaining to either Toronto or the lake or some combination of both. My name is Valerie Franchella, and I'm the program manager for the Toronto and Region Remedial Action Plan. Next slide, please. We have three excellent speakers lined up for you tonight, but before we get to their presentations, we have a few background and housekeeping items to address. And for that, I will pass this on to Leanna.
Thanks, Valerie, and welcome everyone. So just some housekeeping notes. If you're accessing the webinar this evening by phone or tablet, you might have noticed that you can swipe between the webcam view and the slide view so that you can see both our faces and our slides. We'd just like to note that you have been muted to limit background noise, but we would love to hear from you. So if you have a question for one of the speakers, you can enter it in the question box and we'll address the questions at the end of each speaker. Please send in your questions during the presentation so we can collect them on the back end and have them ready for that question and answer period. And if we aren't able to get to your question this evening, we will try to address it at the end of the presentation, or if you want to email us, you're welcome to do that as well. And just finally, we'd like to note this webinar is being recorded and the recording will be made available to you. It'll be on the Toronto and Region RAP or Remedial Action Plan website at torontorap.ca, and it will also be emailed to you following the presentation on the email that you registered for, or with rather. And we'd like to start this event this evening with a land acknowledgement. So although we find ourselves geographically dispersed this evening, meeting here in this online environment, I'd like to begin by recognizing that we all work, live, and gather on traditional Indigenous territory. At TRCA, we respectfully acknowledge that the lands we are situated on are traditional territories and treaty lands. In particular, those of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe of the Williams Treaty First Nations, the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and are now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. Through our work with land and water resources within the Greater Toronto Region, TRCA appreciates and respects the history and diversity of the land and is grateful to have the opportunity to work and meet in this territory. At this time, I invite you to acknowledge the territories and treaty lands in your local area and encourage you to explore the interactive map at native-land.ca, and we'll put a link to that in the chat so that you can explore that further.
So we'll launch this evening with a couple of poll questions just to see who's in the audience. Leanna's gonna bring them up for us now, and you should see a question pop up on your screen. So take a few seconds to fill this out.
We can see that a few of you have voted, so we'll give you another few moments there to choose one of those options on the screen. And I'll close the poll in 3, 2, 1. And we have one more poll we would love to hear from you, so thank you for filling it out.
So take a couple more seconds to fill this in. Are you familiar with the Toronto and Region Remedial Action Plan?
And we'll close that in 3, 2, 1. Thank you so much for your feedback.
Do we have any results from that, Leanna?
Oh, sure. So for the first one, about are you familiar with, or is this your first time attending? 83% of the audience said yes. And for the second question, are you familiar? 33% said yes and 59% said no.
Well, that is amazing and very different from our usual demographic. We usually have about 50-50 people who have been to these events before and know about the Remedial Action Plan, and 50 who are new. So for all our newcomers, Thank you for attending. We welcome you. We're so happy to have you. And for those of you who are joining us again, thanks again for joining us again. So since we have so many new participants with us this evening, I will be providing just a short background on the Toronto and Region Remedial Action Plan, what we do and who we are. Next slide, please. So basically, the Toronto and Region Remedial Action Plan came out of a process that started in the late 1980s, where the International Joint Commission on the Great Lakes identified Toronto as an area of concern. Areas of concern are locations where local environmental degradation poses a threat to the health of the Great Lakes at large. At the time of designation, there were 42 areas of concern, and today there are 36. But the goal of the program is to address environmental issues so that your location is no longer listed as an area of concern, a process known as delisting. Next slide, please. So for each of these areas of concern, they were measured up against 14 potential uses that could be impaired. These were called beneficial use impairments. And of the 14, Toronto received 11, 8 that were impaired, and 3 that required further assessment. Next slide. So to address these impairments, the Toronto and Region Remedial Action Plan, or RAP, was created and identified a series of measures needed to restore the health of Toronto's waters, habitats, fish, and wildlife, with the ultimate goal of delisting Toronto as an area of concern. Next slide. So over the last 30 years, great progress has been made along the Toronto waterfront and within the watersheds of the Toronto area of concern. If you've been around Toronto in the last 30 years, you may have noticed some of these improvements, like more swimmable beaches, more habitat in the watersheds and along the waterfront. Particularly if you've seen Tommy Thompson Park, you may have noticed that now it's a haven for wildlife. And the aesthetic condition of the entire waterfront has also improved. So this has resulted from the implementation of a number of actions, and there are just a few examples on this slide, including extensive stormwater management work, including the implementation of the City of Toronto's Wet Weather Flow Master Plan, improved sewage treatment, the creation and restoration of aquatic and terrestrial habitat, including ongoing projects. So if any of you have walked along in the Portlands near the mouth of the Don River, you may have noticed that there's a project going on there right now to actually reroute the mouth of the Don River. And so the new mouth of the Don River will be built and surrounded by parklands and aquatic habitat. So that's a really great inclusion of more habitat along the Toronto waterfront. We also have ongoing aquatic and terrestrial monitoring and stewardship and education programs. Next slide. Sorry, I think I have a little bit of a delay here. So lastly, I'll leave you with this slide that shows the improvement so far, where we started and where we are today. In 1987, as I said before, we had 8 impaired beneficial use impairments, and today we have 5 that are no longer designated as impaired. For the remaining impairments, we continue to implement actions to redesignate them, and you can find information on these on our website at www.torontorap.ca. Or if you're just interested in events like this and want to hear more about upcoming events or timely news on the Toronto RAP, you can follow us on Twitter at RAP_Toronto. Okay. So with that, we will get into our presentations for this evening, starting with Darren Wybanka. I met Darren a couple of years ago, back in January 2019, where I received a presentation at the Department of Consultation for the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, very similar to the one you'll hear tonight. And it blew my mind, and I thought we really need to have Darren at a Lake Ontario evening. And thanks to this webinar format, we are able to do that. These are were once held in person in Toronto, and that was a little bit trickier for people to get to. So Darren Wybanka is a member of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations and works as the traditional knowledge and land use coordinator for his community. One of his favorite parts of his job is educating others about the history of the Mississaugas of the Credit and the treaty lands and territory of the First Nation. All right. Darren, are you able to turn on your webcam?
I turned on the microphone, pardon me. I've turned on the webcam, and now I'm supposed to share my screen, you tell me. And I'm going to do that.
Your screen's already up, Darren.
It's already up, you can see it?
Yeah.
Amazing. I'm amazed already, and I barely started. Thank you, everybody. I'd like to bring you greetings from the Mississauga of the Credit First Nation. And I'd like to thank you for the land acknowledgement that you delivered right off the top. So I want to get started. We want to find out who the Mississaugas of the Credit are, how they became to be the treaty holders for the Toronto area, and kind of where we're going in the future. So the first slide, is our logo, Mississauga of the Credit First Nation. We were previously known as the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation, but lately the Land Council decided to cut out the new because we are an ancient people. There's nothing new about us. We've been inhabiting the land for a very, very long time. Now, if you would like to know, the Mississaugas are a subgroup of the Ojibwe people. We are partnered, our allies are the Potawatomi and the Odawa people, and you can see that in our logo before it had the 3 fires on it. And the Mississaugas like to be known as the Anishinaabe in their own language, which means the human beings or the people. And we're generally regarded as the people living along the north shores of Lake Ontario and Lake Erie. Now, let me, going too fast. So I'm just going to see what I can do here for a second. Okay, so if we look at my screen, what you see is the lay of the land, the lay of Southern Ontario, when the Europeans first encountered the Mississaugas in 1632, were encountered by the French along the north shores of Lake Huron and Georgian Bay, living a very traditional lifestyle, hunting, fishing, gathering. We moved about the land with the passing seasons, and that is what we were up to. We put our wigwams on the, like I said, the mouths of river creeks flowing into Georgian Bay and Lake Huron. Now, if you notice, you see the other native groups in Southern Ontario at that time. The big ones for us, of course, being the Huron-Wendat and the Neutral people, and of course the Haudenosaunee people, which today are known as the Six Nations Confederacy. Back in those days, we all lived in the pre-contact era, a relatively peaceful life in coexistence. But once the fur trade started, we had a number of problems. The Haudenosaunee people were trading with the British and the Dutch along the east coast of what becomes the United States. The Huron-Wendat were trading with the French along the St. Lawrence River, and the Mississaugas were also trading with the French, and they were using the Huron-Wendat as a middleman. But the fur trade caused a lot of conflict for us, and so it begins a period of warfare known as the Beaver Wars. And those wars are really nasty and bloody in their conflict. It results in the geography of Southern Ontario, or the people of Southern Ontario, being drastically rearranged. The Haudenosaunee attacked into Southern Ontario and drove off the Huron-Wendat. They drove out the Neutral, or absorbed them, and they continued attacking around and going north into the area of the Mississaugas and our allies. And eventually we counterattacked. Whoops. And if you see the map I have now on screen, you can see some of the of the routes we took to take southern Ontario away from the Haudenosaunee people. And so some Mississauga people came down and traveled down the Trent Severn waterway system. And you know those Mississauga people today as the people of Scugog, Alderville, Hiawatha, Curve Lake. And our people, the Mississaugas of the Credit ancestors, attacked down the Toronto Humber Carrying Place trail, and we drove out the Haudenosaunee at this end of the lake. And by the time the war settled, we say it was officially settled in 1701 with the Great Peace of Montreal, the Mississaugas of the Credit ancestors found themselves in possession of about 4 million acres of land at the western end of Lake Ontario. And you can see the wide expanse of land we had here. So Niagara Peninsula all the way past the Grand River a little bit up to the headwaters of the Thames and down over to the Rouge River. I think today the Rouge River is the Rouge National Park. And once again, we lived a very traditional lifestyle down here. We lived on the rivers and creeks flowing into Lake Ontario and Lake Erie. You think the Grand River over here, the Credit River, 16-Mile Creek, 12-Mile Creek, the Credit River, the Humber, the Don. These are the places our ancestors lived. We hunted, we fished, we gathered, and I have right now, it says a slow network collection, and it says connection, turn off the webcam. What should I do, folks? Do you have an idea?
Darren, we can see and hear you clearly, so I think if it looks okay on your end.
All right, good. So that's where we are, living a very traditional lifestyle, and we're continuing to trade. And matter of fact, we trade with the French until they're conquered by the British in 1769. And then we trade rather well with the British. So let's go on. Whoops. So I want to talk a little bit about what is a treaty, because that's a topic tonight. What is a treaty? And I just want to back up one. There we go. There's a definition. It's a negotiated agreement between nations. And in this case, it was initially when it was just First Nations on the land, we negotiated the treaties amongst ourselves as sovereign nations, and we usually memorialize those treaties. And there's an example of wampum on the left-hand side of the screen. And that's the wampum belt of the Treaty of Niagara, 1764. And that was actually a treaty made with the British. And basically, it extends a chain of friendship to the British and the First Nations people of Southern Ontario. And it ratifies an agreement between the British and 24 other First Nations in Southern Ontario. And it basically affirms what we call the Royal Proclamation of 1763, in which the British recognizes the sovereignty of the First Nations on the lands they occupy, and in order to acquire land in Southern Ontario, they first have to make an agreement with the First Nations that occupy the land. By the way, this just on the right-hand side is part of the Toronto Purchase Treaty of 1805. So the little dotems there where we signified our assent to that treaty in 1805. So the treaties, we have the Mississauga of the Credit First Nation has 8 treaties with the Crown, and they all started off because of the American Revolution. And so the British, it was hard to stay loyal to the British Crown. It was George III actually, but if you could stay loyal to George III and you were living in what becomes the United States of America, if you could stay loyal to the king, you were promised land to relocate to. And who had land in Southern Ontario but the First Nations? So the first treaty the British make, it's in 1781, and it's for this red strip of land you see here along the Niagara River. That's the first treaty they make with the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. The treaty enables the British to move around, to portage around Niagara Falls, and they can also use it for agriculture to feed the British troops. The second treaty with the British is for this large purple blotch of land you see there. That's to settle American loyalists, and also part of some of those loyalists were the Haudenosaunee people, the Six Nations people. They fought with the British during the American Revolution and had lost their lands. And so we parted with our lands that they might move into Southern Ontario and have some land again. So that's our first two treaties. And I just want to jump here. These are the treaties that are relevant to the Toronto Region Conservation Area watersheds. And you can see there's a number of, you see the hatched marked area, and though that's the watersheds of the Toronto Region Conservation Authority. You can see the Toronto Purchase, you can see the Head of the Lake Purchase Treaty, and also the Adjutants Treaty. And if you see this pink blotch of land over there, that's also part of our traditionalist territory, but it's not under treaty with us right now. Matter of fact, we call that our Rouge River tract claim. It's under claim with the federal government right now, and that's to actually have that land claim resolved with the federal government and the provincial government, I should say, at the same time. That's working on resolution right now. So here's the big purchase for us is the Toronto Purchase, and it's significant in many ways. It's a controversial purpose. It's a controversial treaty. It was first negotiated in 1787 between the British Crown and our Mississaugas of the Credit ancestors. And the problem was it was never formally recognized or documented on a deed. Years later, well, not too many years later, probably about 10 years later, the British went searching for a land description describing the Toronto Purchase. And the sad thing is, all they could find was a scrap of paper, but no description of the land that was acquired from the Mississaugas of the Credit. And that was problematic because the British now had a problem. They realized, according to their own rules, they had not followed the rules for the acquisition of land. And now much of the land, including the capital at the time, York, was occupied under dubious circumstances. So it wasn't until 1805 that they decided to renegotiate the treaty with Mississaugas of the Credit ancestors. And so that's how we get what we call the Toronto Purchase of 1805. You can call it the Second Toronto Purchase. And the other controversial thing with the Toronto Purchase is, right from the very beginning in 1787, the Mississaugas and the Crown didn't even have a clear understanding of where the boundaries of the land lied. The Mississaugas of the ancestors said the land boundary was at the Humber River. The Crown said, no, the boundary's at Etobicoke Creek. So a lot of controversy right from the start in 1788 that things weren't exactly on the up and up. But nevertheless, in 1805, the treaty is negotiated. The lands of the Toronto Purchase, as you see them now, were purchased for 10 shillings, which maybe you can buy a cup of coffee and a little bit more of that in today's money. And the Crown acquired much more land than was initially bargained for in the 1787 treaty, including the lands of Toronto Island. So for many years, that was a problem. And finally, in 1986, the Mississaugas of the Credit initiated a treaty with the Crown, initiated a claim with the Crown, saying, listen, you took more land than you should have. You didn't pay us enough for it. We acted in good faith and you did not. And so finally in 2010, the land claim was resolved in favor of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation for $145 million, the largest land claim of its time in that history. Now, back to our map, and this is a map of the municipalities of the lower tier and upper tier municipalities. So think once again, Toronto, those 8 treaties that we made were disastrous for the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation because we never really understood what we were getting into. We had always been in friendly terms, of course, with the French. They never wanted land. They wanted any land they wanted was for maybe at most a few acres, either to put a chapel up or a trading post or some sort of thing like that. But they never acquired huge swaths of land for settlement. And the British had that in mind. And we had no meeting of the minds with what we were doing. For the First Nation, we had no concept of the sole proprietorship of land that the Crown had in mind. We think more as a First Nation people. I don't even like the term of using the term ownership, but we had this notion of, I guess I'll say, communal ownership. That everybody lived on the land, we worked off the land, we were responsible for the land, we had a duty to respect it and be wise stewards of it, and we would share the land. And that's what we intended when we signed our treaties. It wasn't really until, like I said, 1787, that first Toronto Purchase Treaty where we didn't agree with boundaries, that maybe the rot was starting to settle in. But in 1806, or I should say in 1805, the day after we negotiated the Toronto Purchase Treaty, the 1805 Toronto Purchase Treaty, we negotiated what we call the Head of the Lake Treaty. We negotiated that in 1805. It was ratified in 1806. And one of our chiefs stood up to the Crown and said, listen, when we gave up our lands, to share with you, we expected that we would learn things from you. We would learn things from the farmers. We would trade. And instead, when we try to move about our lands, to camp, to hunt, to fish, to gather, we find our ways barred by angry farmers, their guns, they shoot our dogs. None of the promises that you have fulfilled us you have promised us have come to fruition. We're sad that this has come, but nevertheless, we did reluctantly agree to the head of the lake purchase, and that's that green little spot you see along the north shore of Lake Ontario. As I said earlier, the treaties were disastrous for us. We went from 4 million acres of land to 200 acres at the Credit River, and that's what we had left. So very disastrous. We couldn't hunt, we couldn't fish. As our land base diminished, so did our ability to feed ourselves, to clothe ourselves. Our population was decimated. We started out our treaty making in 1781 with 500 of the Mississaugas of the Credit ancestors. By the time our last treaty was signed in 1820, and you can see that little brown patch by the Credit River, we were down to 280 people. We're down to 200 people. We thought we were on the verge of extinction, and the Crown thought we were on the verge of extinction. And so the last treaties that we actually negotiated, treaty number 22 and 23, those yellow blotches you see and the brown blotch you see, were basically done, negotiated with the promise that the government would provide us with education and would provide us food for our people. So fortunately for our people, one of our own band members came in time with a plan to rescue us from extinction. His name is, I'm not even going to try and pronounce it because I'm not fluent in Ojibwe, but his name is Peter Jones. He's the son of the Deputy Provincial Surveyor, Augustus Jones, and a Mississauga of the Credit woman. Her name is Tuba Bananakwe. And he lives with his mother's people. He learns his native ways, but later on he becomes a convert to Christianity, and he decides the way to save his people is to convert them to Christianity and to give them a settler-style education, particularly in agriculture, so that they can learn and live and work on a level playing field with the settlers that are coming into the land. And remember, at one time, the Mississaugas were masters of the land. Now, as the flood of loyalists come into the territory, we're positively overwhelmed by settlers. We're by far in the minority. So Peter Jones sets out, and by 1825, he converts the Mississaugas of the Credit Band to Christianity, Methodism, and we become very pious and strict Methodists. And he teaches us how to farm. And so by 1826, we move into the mission village at the Credit River. Matter of fact, you can see where that village is today. If you're driving down the QEW from Toronto to Hamilton and you cross the Credit River and you take a look out your passenger side window and you look down on the Mississauga Golf and Country Club, that's where you'll see our village was located. Our ancestors are still buried somewhere under the golf course. We're not exactly sure where, but there we are. And while we're at the Credit River Mission Village, we learn, our people become literate. We learn how to read, write, all the great read, write, do arithmetic, the three R's of an education. We learn how to farm. We were not agriculturalists before, but we learn how to farm. We learn all about animal husbandry. We learn about keeping chickens and cows and pigs and lambs, all that sort of thing. And we learn about business. We're the major shareholders of the Credit River Harbor Company. We set up the town lots at the mouth of the Credit River, and we actually set up stores, and we build our own schooner to ply about the Great Lakes. So it was a major time of transformation for the Mississauga people. It's kind of our golden age. But the problem is, even though we advanced much, and even the governor at the time was amazed, a man by the name of Sir Francis Bondhead came to see us, and he was amazed because he really didn't think First Nations people could be civilized. But here were First Nations people with a fine village as good as any settlers in Upper Canada at the time. The problem for us was we could never get title to our land. Even though we cleared land, we farmed, we had our mission village with 40 houses, stores, carpenter shops, and so on, we could not gain title to our lands. Even today, as a First Nations person living on the New Credit First Nation, I don't have title to my land. It's still held with the Crown. I merely have the right to occupy the land. I don't own it per se. So that was a problem. And so in 1847, the land was about to be sold by the Crown, and we were about to be homeless. But and we weren't sure where we were going to go. There was some thought of moving to the Mississauga Nations farther to the west of us, like Scugog. My own ancestors were originally come from Rice Lake, and that area. So we were really at a loss, but of all the people that came to our rescue was the Six Nations. Remember those people that we drove out in the Beaver Wars, and then we parted with our Treaty 3 land so that they could have a homeland? Well, they heard about our plight, and they said, we remembered what you did for us during the American Revolution. You gave us land. Now we want to return the favor for you. So they returned lands to us at on their parcel of land at the Grand River, and we happily moved here in 1847. Go back, and just here's a picture of some of our contemporary photos today, and some of our buildings now. I always like to say we never quite replicated what we had at the Credit River. We were still along water, which we had always been at the Credit at the Credit River. Even when we were living in Northern Ontario, we lived along the water. We moved into Southern Ontario, we lived along the water. We come to the new Credit, as it's now called, and we're landlocked. We have two small creeks. Both are dry as all get out in the summer. We're not going to float a schooner. We don't need harbors. We can't even build a mill that works well. So that's a problem. We suffered, but we did well at agriculture. So I'm almost through with my time, but I just want to wrap up. We still see ourselves as progressive, and we still work at, I guess you would say, in a way, modern day treaty making, modern day agreements with the Crown. And the latest agreement we're working at, or we're trying to initiate, is the Mississaugas of the Credit water claim that was initiated with the Crown in 2016. And in all of our treaties with the Crown, all those 8 treaties, all but one were silent on waters. The Crown, you see, was interested in our lands, and they needed that for settlement, they needed it for military purposes, communication purposes, but they never talked about water, except our Treaty 23 lands. That's at the Credit River, and they talked about water in that particular treaty because they were going to build a bridge across the Credit River, and so hence the mention of water in our treaty, in that particular treaty. So we have the water claim in 2016, where we initiated with the Government of Canada and the province a claim to all the water, groundwater, floodplains within our treaty lands and territory. And so that's been laid before the government for the last, 2016, last 5 years. So we're working on it. And one of the things we are, as a people, are interested in, we did a study with University of Guelph, and one of the things we want to determine is, what do we want to do with our water claim? Well, we want to do 3 things. First, we want to revigorate our ties to water. Water's always been important to us. Like I said, in Northern Canada, or Northern Ontario, we lived up north on Lake Huron. When we moved in Southern Ontario, Lake Huron and Lake Erie. And we want to reestablish our ties spiritually, culturally, and so on. So that's one thing we want to do. Second thing we want to do is preserve water, improve water. We say we want to conserve water and make it well and worthy for our children for the next 7 generations. We use that term 7 generations, but really for our people, it means forever. We promote the wise use of water and conservation and so on. And the third thing we want to be able to do is sustain ourselves with our waters, so it can sustain and nurture our people as well, because we want the spirit of the treaties honored, to share the land. Our treaties are sacred things to us. We intend to honor the spirit of the treaties, to share their lands and waters and resources. And the interesting thing is, you look at our treaties, they really read like real estate transactions. They do not give us rights per se. We have inherent rights. We have those inherent rights. That's what we speak of when we talk about our rights in Southern Ontario. So I challenge you, take a look at our treaties, all 8 of them. Take a look at our website, find out the little details, find out about the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and don't ever be afraid to ask questions of our people. It's been a pleasure. My time is about up here. It's been my pleasure. I've given you a very, very brief overview. So I'd welcome the time to chat more, but that's where I will leave it for now. So in the words of my ancestors and some of their talks with the government, this is all we have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Darren. That was excellent. We have a lot of questions coming in right now and some comments just talking about how great this presentation was. Let's start with how many colonial families were present at the time Treaty 13 was signed, and how many Mississauga of the credit families were present?
The Mississaugas, and when Treaty 13 was signed, I would guess at the time about 300, give or take, is what I would say, moving about the land. It's hard to pin us down at any one particular time, except of course when we congregated at the River Credit during the fishing seasons. In terms of the people at York at the time, in 1805, I'm guessing, and this is a guess for me, probably no more than 1,500, max 2,000 at best. At best.
Okay. At that time.
Right.
Excellent. So I'll read this next question, which is kind of related to this one, from Arlene. What is the population of the Mississauga of the Credit First Nation today?
The Mississaugas of the Credit today, there's about 2,600 of us, at least last time I checked formally. It might be up a little bit. I think 2,600 was a figure about 4 or 5 years ago. So we're probably up a little bit now. About 1/3 of us live on the reserve, and about 2/3 live away, more or less in the Golden Horseshoe area. But we have band members that live in England of all places, and Australia as well.
Oh, wow. Amazing. Okay, next question from David. Was much of the land acquired by the Crown through treaties then sold on, or maybe granted or gifted on, by the Crown to private, i.e. non-governmental persons?
Well, I can just say, I think I understand the question. Put it this way, all the land, we are, like I said, by the time 1820 rolled around, we were down to 200 acres. The rest of it was more or less bought by the settlers or granted to the settlers for past services. It's hard for me to say how much was actually given away, but you can tell by, it's all gone now, all but 200 acres in 1820, it was gone.
Okay, thank you. Next question from Christine. You mentioned that the intent of the treaties was to share the land. In the ideal circumstances, what would that look like moving forward?
Oh boy, moving forward, I'm not 100% sure what that looks like. I do say for sure sharing the land, once again, means that we should all share a responsibility to care for it. That's one thing, you know, there's no doubt about. But what it means to share the land today, I think that put this way, we gave up the ability to sustain ourselves when we parted with those lands in the treaties with the settlers. I think some way what we have to do is explore modern ways to sustain ourselves on the treaty lands in new 21st century ways. So I'm not sure what that looks like yet. I think it's something we have to think about more.
Okay, thank you, Darren. How can settlers who are in areas like the Toronto Islands support the water claims and reconciliation? And I'll add this other one because it connects. I'm wondering whether the Toronto Islands were ever included in any of the 8 treaties.
Well, according to the Crown, of course, the 1805 treaty, they're included. And so that's the way it is. I think a way to start the reconciliation process is just simple. You started with a land acknowledgement. And that's a very, very simple way of acknowledging whose land that you're sharing, the people that you're sharing the land with, the people that you made the deals and agreements with. That when you go to school, you're learning and teaching on the lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. You're going to work on the lands and the treaty areas of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. You recognize when you work on the land in a stewardly way and you look to preserve things, that you recognize that First Nations do have inherent rights, that you see that we are a valued people in the in Canadian society. All those little things need to be acknowledged, that there is an Aboriginal people, that we are one of the founding nations of Canada. Canada says that there's 3 founding nations: the First Nations people, the French, and the English. Well, okay, what does that mean to recognize us as a founding people? What are those truth and reconciliation promises that were put out by the Truth and Reconciliation Committee and by Murray Sinclair? What about the past injustices? What are we doing to wrong those past injustices and correct those injustices? And what are we doing to cooperate with the First Nations in getting them on the right footing?
Wow, yeah, that gives us so much to think about here, Darren. I think we're going to have to cap off questions at this time, but there are so many here, and if we have time at the end, we will try and get to as many as we can. We'll also try and answer some after the presentation. Darren, and to our other presenters, we'll be sharing the questions. So thank you so much for all of your questions. And Darren Miigwech, thank you so much for your presentation. The comments here are people asking, you know, when can you have Darren back again? We would really like to hear more from him. So
good. Thank you.
Great. Excellent. Thank you. So I think my computer is a little bit frozen right now, but hopefully everyone can hear me. Next up, we have Gary Pritchard. Gary is a conservation ecologist and Indigenous engagement and placemaking specialist from the Curve Lake First Nation. Gary has had the privilege to work on behalf of Indigenous peoples throughout Ontario and Canada. He has traveled and worked in almost 300 Indigenous communities throughout Canada and the Northern United States. He believes that if individuals, especially youth, can form a connection with nature, then all people can make conscious decisions on how we impact Mother Earth and the next 7 generations. Gary, please do take it away.
Thanks, Val. Ane, hello, everyone. Yeah, great to be here. Thank you, Darren, for the knowledge you shared. I always find it super hard and intimidating to follow up after our knowledge keepers, but I'll try my best. Yeah, so before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm in my home territory of the Williams Treaty First Nations, in my home in Treaty 18. And yes, welcome. So I'm going to talk about the Mississauga people of the eastern shores of Lake Ontario, or the other Mississaugas that you might just not know about, and just like to share that. And we also have our Chippewa nations as well. And I'll take the next slide, please. Oh, here we go. So we're going to play a little game before we start. Oh, can we just back up a second? Sorry, I missed the question, even though these are my questions. So we're going to play a game called, I call it Trick or Treaty. Those who do know me have played this game in the past, and I just want to ask some multiple choice questions to see what you know, because a lot of my everyday work is actually teaching people how to work with Indigenous communities and treaty recognition. So Question number 1, a First Nation is A, an Aboriginal government body organized by a community. B, can include status and non-status Indians. C, can be a band, one band, or include of several different bands. C, can replace the term band. Or E, all the above. And we'll go to the polling questions now.
I actually can't run this poll now because I did open it and close it, so I will put it at the end. Maybe we can just move to the next poll.
Problem. So, how many First Nations are there in Canada? That's always a great question I usually get asked, and I thought I'd ask you all to see what you think. And no using your phone since I can't see you.
So I can see some votes have come in, so I'll leave it open for another 5 seconds. And we'll close the poll. And so, Gary, it looks like, you know, the audience is pretty split, but about half think it's 634.
Yes, and that's actually correct. That's fantastic. Next slide. How many treaties are there in Ontario? That's one of my favorite questions. A, 108, B, 52, C, 152, D, 46, and E, none of the above.
Okay, you can see some votes rolling in. We'll leave the poll open for 5 more seconds. All right, thank you for voting. It looks like, again, pretty split, about 20% for all of them.
And it's actually 46. And the next slide, please. And this is one of my favorite questions I like to ask people when we start doing their cross-cultural awareness training is rights to hunting and fishing are a treaty right or a product of a treaty right. Is that true or false?
All right, we'll leave the poll up for 5 more seconds. Okay, so about 63% of the audience said true and 37% said false.
And the answer is actually false. It is actually our inherent right to hunt and fish, and that's actually not part of the treaty making process. And I think that's where a lot of the confusions happen when we start talking about rights-based harvesting across the landscape. And we could talk about that more later at the end of the presentation. All right. So what are we going to cover while we're talking together? It's just basically about our Mississauga side, our perspective, our side of the lake and Lake Ontario watersheds. They're just on the other side of the Don River. I'll take the next slide, please. So who are we? We're the Mississauga people. We're also known as the people of the Big River mouth. We're also known as the Salmon people, and you know, who once occupied the north shore of Lake Ontario and its various tributaries. And I always share a personal story about that connection to the salmon. I've been salmon fisherman since I was like 11 or 12 years old, and I never understood my connection to the salmon of Lake Ontario. Unfortunately, it took me going to school and becoming a biologist to realize that those salmon that I fish for are actually technically invasive, but there's always been that draw to salmon, and that's what the elder said. That's that my blood connection to the salmon that makes them so connected to my well-being. So the Mississauga oral history speak to our people being in this area for thousands of years. The stories of the old ones recount stories of the ancient Algonquin dialect.
Yeah.
The histories explain that the current language is in the 5th transformation of our language, demonstrating the connection that spans
No, thank you.
a deep over time connection. And I often tell people too, and there's 9 ways to speak the Ojibwe or Anishinaabe language. So understand that even the way I write it and speak it is different than my Southern Ontario family. Next slide, please. The territory, our traditional teachings have taught us that before contact, we shared the land with other tribes such as the Potawatomi, the Odawa, the Huron, and eventually the Haudenosaunee. We are the traditional people of Lake Ontario and its tributaries, and this entire area has been Mississauga territory basically forever. The territories of the Mississauga people, and I mean all of us, are from Gananoque in the east all the way to the north shore of Lake Ontario towards the Lake Erie Long Point shoreline. And our territory goes all the way from up to Bancroft, Ontario, over to the Halberton Highlands, and it includes the tributaries that flow from the height of land Toronto, like the Oakland Ridges Moraine, and all the rivers that flow into Lake Ontario. It's a vast territory, and it's basically what everybody calls Central Ontario now. Next slide, please. So a lot of the talks I do is, like, I call it Treaties 101. So we have to start understanding what our role, all our collective role is within treaty. And many people think treaty rights are special sets of Indigenous rights, but all people live actually in treaty and have their own responsibilities to the treaties that we live in. Treaties are the foundation part of our Canadian society, and you can't go anywhere. Every house, every road, building, or business that exists are part of the treaty-making process, and that's why we are the way we are today. Next slide, please. So rights, this is a question I get quite a bit. What are inherent rights versus treaty rights? This is actually a map of our Treaty 20, as well as the fish sanctuaries that were enforced on us on the Williams Treaty community side of things. We were actually, the Crown did not acknowledge our treaty correctly, and they actually said we were restricted to 150 meters of our, or 150 feet of our shoreline. Prior to our settlement in 2018 and reaffirming of our rights. So Indigenous rights, so those are inherent rights, are those that flow through Indigenous people. There are things that we've enjoyed previously to European contact, our rights to hunt and fish, our rights to do ceremony, our rights to even define ourselves as Indigenous people. That's what inherent rights are. Treaties are legally binding agreements that are set aside of those rights, responsibility, and relationships between the federal and provincial government. And they cover things like payment of goods and monies, First Nations title to certain lands, the creation of reserves, protection of fishing and hunting and harvesting rights. That's the difference between inherent and treaty rights, the promises of school, clothing, and farming equipment. I'll take the next slide. Treaty, I love this picture. Treaty and treaty map, treaty overlaps. Oh, back up 1 second, sorry. Of course, there's always treaty and traditional territory overlaps. There's several reasons why there's treaty and territory overlaps. One, Europeans brought them crude methods of mapping. If they only had GPS and municipal boundaries, we'd have been a lot better off than we were, because we'd have figured out what maps were. Also, we already had community boundaries and treaties amongst each other nations to actually explain our rules of hunting within each other's territory. So we always had that. It's just when Europeans came, it brought a more complicated layer of doing this. And you heard Darren speak of that so well when I heard him speak. Next slide, please. History of treaties. The Mississauga people participated in 18 treaties from 1781 to 1923 to allow for the accommodation of the growing numbers of European settlers coming to the what we call Southern Ontario now. Pressure from an increasing settlement forced the Mississauga people to move into small family groups. And you heard Darren and migration story, as well as ours, is very similar, that we were restricted to where we're growing. And what you see here is a map that I've been working on is watersheds and just the different boundaries that we work in. And if you look at where we are here in Lake Ontario, we're from our treaty side of it is called the Gunshot Treaty, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Next slide, please. So we talked about Treaty 13, so I don't have to cover that at all. But our treaty for that part of area is called the Gunshot Treaty. It was signed in 1792. And it was written to capture the Indigenous people's ability to hunt, live, and occupy the shores of Lake Ontario. I have heard two stories of where the gunshot was actually fired. If you look and talk to Crown representatives, it was fired on the shores of the Bay of Quinte. I heard it was fired in Port Hope or Cobourg, Ontario. But anyways, the light purple area that you see goes all the way from the Bay of Quinte all the way up into close to adjacent to the Toronto Purchase, and all the way up to the shores of Lake Simcoe. So apparently in 1792, that's how far a gunshot would travel if you fired either in Port Hope, Cobourg, or Bay of Quinte. Yeah, that was really interesting when we started our treaty negotiation, or our reaffirmation of our rights. And Indigenous peoples would always have the ability to camp 66 feet from the shore of banks of any water source. And it involved the signatories of the Williams Treaty First Nations. And what's really interesting about this treaty area too, and our understanding is that it said no settler could ever occupy the waters. We never signed the rights away to water away, and so anything that involves water taking or water use has to have a consent from our people. Settlers could only own 6 inches of land because they were used for farming. And so with that, I often make the joke too, if like when we start doing negotiations, that if your basement's finished or your municipal infrastructure is there, we own it. And that gets people really thinking about that whole complication of the treaty making process, and where do they fit in the role of treaty, and how to honor the treaty that they've their ancestors have signed with us. Another thing, a neat thing about our treaty area, it says you can't destroy or harm any wetlands, headwater streams, or sugar bushes, because those are areas of harvest and use for us. And we know because of current land development practices that is currently happening on a daily basis. Typically where the boundary is that we've looked at, because I like to try to use references that people can understand. Typically the 404 highway tends to be where we say that's where the Gunshot Treaty border is. And I'll take the next slide, please. So our modern day agreement, and any modern day agreement is those signed after 1975. And they have different things written within those modern day agreements, but there's obviously the ability for consultation and participation amongst projects, ownerships of lands, harvesting rights to bring forth back those rights that people think that we signed away, which we didn't, financial settlements, and the ability to have taxational purposes. And I'm looking towards, right now we're understanding our roles and rights and responsibilities around the aggregate industry. Participation in land use management, including very specific areas like the nuclear industry or the hydroelectric industry. Resource revenue sharing, to be able to, that's one of the things that people don't understand. We want to participate in the Canadian economy, and you know, be a part of the planning process that takes effect amongst municipalities, and have acknowledgement that we have a presence. One of the things I often get told by people who visit Ontario and Canada is that when they come to the GTA especially, there's no Indigenous presence along the shores of Lake Ontario. They don't know that we are still here, and we're still thriving here as a people, and we really need to ramp that up to how we make it more available and seen. Next slide, please. Our relationship with salmon, since you know, it wouldn't be a Lake Ontario night if we didn't talk more about Atlantic salmon and how we're trying to restore this fish. And this is our oral history of the Atlantic salmon. And I'm a, like I shared with everybody, I'm a big salmon fisherman, so I always like to talk about salmon. In 1792, the scholar Francis Adrian Van der Kamp wrote that Lake Ontario watersheds were so healthy, never did I see a country where all the fish were so abundant and good. And as Indigenous people, we would honor the runs of salmon through ceremony and be thankful every year for the harvest. Typical ways we used to harvest salmon were torches and spears. We used fishing weirs, and it was told to us that the salmon would actually somehow make all the way up to like the shores of Lake Simcoe, as well as the Ganaraska River, and we'd have fishing weirs at these big locations to harvest these fish that travel through. How do we know as Indigenous people to stop harvesting? Well, we knew to stop harvesting the salmon and other species of fish when the leaves on the trees grew the size of a fox's ear. That's our traditional knowledge around that, or essentially our quota on when we knew when to stop. It was told by our knowledge keepers that that the salmon populations began to diminish once European settlement started showing up along the shores of Lake Ontario. And since Europeans started to look at this fish as a commodity, an economy, the Creator took it away from all of us to punish us for the betrayal for everyone, because we started not to share equally. And then we've done a lot of habitat destruction and river alterations, making it not suitable potentially for salmon runs to return ever, in my scientific opinion. But if we truly want to restore this species, I've been working with elders and knowledge keepers, and we need to ask forgiveness through the process of ceremony and look into Indigenous knowledge systems to create a restoration and co-governance structure of how to restore our rivers. Next slide, please. So creating an environment where we can all benefit from. So make sure that people understand treaty rights are recognized by Section 35 of the Constitution. That's not me rock climbing, just so everybody knows. I don't know if that's what everybody else is saying, but that's not me. All Canadian people are beneficiaries of treaties, whether it be the Crown on the settler side or the Indigenous side, or both. Treaty relations are about getting along together, so we need to actually work on that relationship. I often tell proponents when they come into our office that Canada's relationship with our marriage together with the Indigenous and non-Indigenous population is very much in marriage counseling, and we're working through it right now. So that's where my perspective is as we go down this road of reconciliation together. We're still working out how to get along together. We just need to learn how to honor and respect each other. Next slide, please. And with that, I'd like to thank you for coming. I do wish everybody's family wellness and safety during these crazy times, and I will open it up to questions. We probably have the other question too that we missed in the beginning.
Hi, Gary. Sorry about my unmuting earlier. Surprise unmuting at the exact moment when my partner came in to offer me some water. So, so let's start with Mississauga and Mississauga. Are they essentially the same word?
Yeah, yeah. So how we say Mississauga is actually Mississauga.
Great, thank you. Is science accepted, and how does it fit in with your traditional knowledge?
Ooh, that's a good question. That seems to be a conversation every day these days. What we like to do is actually build parallel cases for both. So how do I explain that better? So I've been using traditional knowledge to develop. So I'll give an example. We believe that through my family's traditional knowledge of a spot where I've always fished since I was a little kid, that these fish that typically spawn in the spring also spawn in the fall. So I brought that to a whole bunch of regulators' attentions and actually took them down to show them that this was actually happening. And then through Western science, we were able to build a scientific study to actually monitor the health of those fish. So it's a marriage of both knowledge systems, a whole, hey, we've lived on these lands and harvested these areas for hundreds of thousands of years, to how do we use Western science with that knowledge to best pair them together. So we actually use both knowledge systems quite a bit on our side. It's because we believe it creates a more holistic study design. We have the, and I call it, I also interview farmers and other people who work the land for a couple of generations, so that we actually have that ability to know what's going on out in the land. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, I think so. Gary, what would be the best way to show your presence on the shores of Lake Ontario?
So I've said this to other friends of mine at TRCA, because we do get to spend a lot of time together and teach together. I would love to see canoes put in every city hall or recreational hub, and we'd have 2 canoes, one acknowledging the past of the people there, and one canoe painted to represent the present day people who live there as well. We have a traditional birch bark canoe that's made by our canoe builders in our territories, depicting the families and the clans that used to live there and they live there today, as well as another canoe painted to show the people here now. And I think that's a great start, and it's just something, because I think it's just something I've been really thinking about a lot lately.
Very cool. Thanks, Gary. How can we educate settlers to act as better treaty partners?
Ooh, that's a good question. So part of it starts we've been talking about this quite a lot in our side and in our community of Curve Lake, and one of it is we're actually going to start rolling out contractor education. So people who come and want to do projects in our side of the territory can come and learn from us. That we have, we're starting to make videos too, but so people can watch on online and stuff like that, because we know people don't read as much as they should anymore. So we're doing stuff like that, the contractor education. But then we also believe there should be a component of on the land learning in every in every public school and places like that. We really break it down with the children. I look at how well we rolled out recycling back in the day. It was through the education of children. I think that's what we need to do too, is educate our young ones better, so that they are able to adapt and understand where they fit in Canada.
Absolutely, makes sense. To piggyback on that question, how as individuals can we improve our relationship? For example, I have a cabin near Bancroft and would love to build relationships locally.
Ooh, I used to live in Bancroft. A little special spot there for me. But yeah, it's just reaching out, right? You're not far from my home community. You're about 90 kilometers actually, where that cabin is. So come to maybe some of our events. We do hold, everybody likes to come to our powwows. Once we're able to do that again, please come and learn from us. And travel to different communities. Come to the Teaching Rocks or the Petroglyph Provincial Park. That's actually where I started my environmental career, and both my environmental and Indigenous learning journey. I was 16 when I started working there, and that's actually where I started learning our culture as well, because it wasn't really discussed in my home as a kid. And it's just a learning journey that you can go on, and you can email me if you need more resources too. I include my email there so that people know the right resources to check too. Not all the internet stuff that you find is accurate.
Great. Can you elaborate on the 6-inch comment? Are you saying that ownership of land by a settler is limited to 6 inches down into the earth, and that below the First Nations may still have rights?
Yes. So how the treaty was worded on our side was it's actually the depth of a plow. The treaties were set based on the fact that when they came to our side of the lake, they were farming people. And so that's how the depth of a plow would have gone historically before modernization of the use of machines. So it's that's a really interesting point when we start bringing that up as part of our rights-based question we have when we look at different projects, as well as to echo Darren's comment of that we've never signed the rights to water away. Thus, we have to establish our relationship to who owns the water and lake beds.
Great, thank you, Gary. We have one more important question. Where is Gary's secret fishing spot?
For what species?
I think this was a joke question from Michael. Or what was the one you mentioned, the shark pike?
What did I say that? I say a lot of things. So the Toronto Islands are actually really good for pike and carp fishing if anyone wants to go there. But that's the only tip I will give on this webinar.
On record.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Gary. Many of the questions are also just saying, excellent presentation, really appreciate this, would love to hear you speak again. So thank you, Miigwech. Really appreciate having you here tonight. And if we have time at the end, we may get you to come back in and answer a few more of these questions along with the other presenters.
Great, all right.
Thanks, Gary. All right, so our last presenter is Lindsay Kretschmer, who is an executive director of the Toronto Aboriginal Support Services Council. Kretschmer's family comes from 6 nations of the Grand River Territory. She is German and Mohawk Wolf Clan, and her spirit name is Swooping Hawk. She has worked in the nonprofit sector for nearly 20 years, most recently as the executive director of the Ontario Aboriginal HIV/AIDS strategy. Kretschmer is passionate about Indigenous community well-being and is committed to developing sustainable and measurable solutions for social change and lasting impact. Oh, good, you're there.
Would you like me to go ahead?
Yes, please.
All right, Sego, good evening. Nyawa for the introduction. Really nice to be here with you tonight, and just want to acknowledge my 2 friends that went before me for their very in-depth and insightful presentations. Mine's a little bit different. It's going to focus more on the contemporary social services sector in the Toronto area, and a touch point on some of the history that led us to this point. We acknowledge more and more within different spaces the traditional land stewardship, and we acknowledge the treaties. What I'm taught in Haudenosaunee culture is to give acknowledgement for all things, and so in a lot of different cultures, there's different ways to give acknowledgement. Most definitely, we have something called the Thanksgiving address, also known as the words that come before all else. And for us, this is a way of acknowledging all of these things that we have in this physical world, all of those things within the spiritual realm, the things we can see, touch, and feel, and the things that we can't. Essentially, it's acknowledging all of creation and giving gratitude for everything that we are afforded and provided in an effort to live a good life on this earth. And so I'll just jump right in from there. Really quick agenda. We delve really briefly into the past, we go to the present, and then to the future. Quick disclaimer, this presentation does not reflect nor represent the views of all Indigenous folks. It certainly doesn't speak on behalf of or for Indigenous communities. These views are my own teachings, experiences, and knowledge that I've gathered through multiple sources. And it's really, I think, important for me to say that living in a city as diverse as Toronto, as my friends have said, there's no single First Nation. Toronto's made up of, First Nations, Métis, Inuit, mixed ancestry, mixed race, and a whole host of other factors and intersecting identities that certainly lend to distinctive cultures, languages, ceremonies, and just general identity pieces that I think we are as richly diverse as notions as diversity goes. So quick fast facts beyond the bio. I'm born and raised here in Toronto, actually 2nd generation on the Indigenous side, born in an urban area, raised in an urban area. I grew up predominantly in Scarborough, so the east end of Toronto. now residing in the East York area. I'm mixed with German, so I'm Mohawk Wolf Clan on my father's side and German on my mother's side. My spirit name is Swooping Hawk, and I got this spirit name through a ceremony I attended when I was 17 years old, and just sort of to pay recognition to the urban Indigenous space here. For a lot of us who either grew up in the space here in Toronto or who migrated here from a local First Nation or other territory, a lot of us do access social service supports in an effort to gain access to culture, to some semblance of community. And so I actually earned my spirit name here in the city, and not on the land from my home community, which is where my family comes from, which is Six Nations. My current role is the ED of the Toronto Aboriginal Support Services Council, also known as TASC, which is a coalition made up of multi-sector service leaders from different Indigenous-led organizations across the city that form this council. It's a really good fortune to be in a role like this because it is my passion to work in support service areas. And yeah, I've been in the role for close to 3 years, and it's a lot of fun. So who is my family? And I share this with, some degree of hesitation, but also a lot of interest in being sort of vulnerable, because I think it helps to show the portrait of what some urban Indigenous folks' experiences are. And in the context of my experience, I'll share a little bit. So this is my grandmother, Otishtanokwa, meaning morning star. This is what she looks like. This is her Ongwe Hongwe card, recognizing her nation, her clan, her birth date, and her spirit name, and her government name as well. This other image up here is her being published in the 80s in York University's Women's Studies course curriculum to share what her experiences were as an Indigenous woman who had to work very hard to reclaim aspects of her own identity, culture, and language. And she did that through sitting as a board member on what was formerly known as the Iroquoian Institute, now today known as the Jake Thomas Learning Center. She was very close friends with Chief Jake Thomas's wife, Yvonne Thomas, and her daughter Phyllis. And so she was working, to try to restore aspects of her own identity, given her own shaky family history. Being one of 8 siblings, it was not uncommon for there to be disconnection to Indigenous identity and culture due to our history here in Canada that aimed to sort of have us assimilated into dominant society, which for many Native people, it held a degree of shame to identify who you actually were. And so for many of us, it's really hard work to reclaim what was lost. My grandmother came here really young. She left home very early on. She was 16, I think, when she first left home. She came to Toronto. She had my father and my uncle. So she was a single mother to 2 sons who she raised out in Scarborough, and worked part-time and full-time jobs while at the same time trying to connect back to her culture and spending a lot of time at Six Nations in doing so. I share this image with you too because I think it's important that when, for folks who are learning to contextualize notions of Indigenous identities, indigeneity, it's important to sort of make note that we may not always look like you expect us to. So in one of the lower images there of my uncle, my cousin, and her son, what you're seeing is 3 generations of Mohawk people, but you may not necessarily know upon first glance that they are in fact Indigenous. My father meets my mother, I guess sometime in the late 70s, and by the 80s, boom, baby Swooping Hawk is born. And those years came with her. My mom and my dad would not stay together long. I would be raised mostly with the German side of my family, not really getting access to the Native side until I met my father again when I was about 11 years old. And I had always known growing up that, there were 2 parts to my identity. One we didn't speak of, and one that was encouraged to be embraced, which was, the sort of the German household and Lutheran values. But, you grow up sort of knowing that there's that piece that you want to figure out and find. And so, thankfully for the social service sector, I was able to work really hard in reclaiming some of that. These are my kids, Kayla, Emily, and Jamie. His spirit name is Fast Wind. He's about 7 kids rolled into one. I'm a very lucky mama. These two girls live on their own and go to post-secondary, and they both are connected to their culture through working in community currently. And this little guy is doing kindergarten virtually right now, like many of you who are parents, I'm sure, are experiencing. I really want to touch on, I think, the importance of my children, culture, and connection to identity. I think it was into my teens that I discovered Council Fire Native Cultural Center. It was a Native friend of mine who was like, yeah, you got to check out the center. You can, go see them and maybe volunteer or do some work for them. And so I walked in not knowing who to talk to, what to ask, and feeling a bit like an outsider, but being brave and courageous enough to walk through the doors. And I started volunteering with them. I was connecting with other Native social services in the city at the time, and just sort of navigating, what different ways to access culture, ceremony, and programs that provided these elements could afford me as an urban Indigenous person who was in search of these things. If you Google right now on whatever device is closest to you, cultural reclamation, the Google is very smart. It can geo-pinpoint your exact location. It knows you're in Canada. It knows that Indigenous people are searching for something, because for those of you that have Googled cultural reclamation, the first few hits that you're going to see are Indigenous. And yet you didn't type the word Indigenous, but the Google knows that this is a unique thing that many Indigenous folks are having to grapple with, and especially in urban centers. So going back to before, in a pre-contact Indigenous societal structure, and certainly cannot speak for all, but commonly we were a society that did have, contrary to popular belief, good governance and structure. In fact, we wouldn't have thrived in the absence of these things. We had at the center of most cultures, I would think universally, children protected by those adults, those caregivers, the aunties, the uncles, the elders, parents, and the warriors. And at the center of that too, in the middle of our sort of our bundle, our neha, our songs, our ceremonies, our clothing, our food, our customs, our stories, all of that protected at the center where the children were as well. So at the center of this, sort of societal structure rendition, children and culture were really the heart of everything. Indigenous folks had a shared common purpose, good balance, harmony, connection, and relationship to the land. A great love and a deep spirituality that I think was really important for our societies to be able to thrive in a good way. Important too is that elders were also the transmitters of knowledge and language down to the young people, to the children. While the adults were taking care of internal and external affairs, it was the elders' responsibility oftentimes to make sure that knowledge transmission occurred. And as we know through residential schools and other systematic acts of assimilation, we, having had children and culture removed from the center of a community, took us to a very different post-contact state. When children were forcibly removed, and in many instances, culture forbidden from being practiced, in fact, it carried with it a jail sentence if you were found to be practicing your ceremonies, what we were left with, I think, was a lot of displacement and disconnection, and in particular to the land. As my friend spoke about, this migration and movement away from the land until it's, you're moved so far away and from the connection to the very thing that you know to be home. Certainly that comes with a lot of displacement, disharmony. And I think more importantly for us, it was a loss and a destruction of values. And there was a lot of pain in place of the love and the value that was at the center of everything. And like I said, because of the many assimilation aims throughout history, and it was no one single event that led us to this place, a great number of us have to continue that journey of seeking out who we are so we can pass that down to our own children. I want to share with you a quick teaching that I received from Yvonne Thomas of the Jake Thomas Learning Center. I had once worked for an Indigenous organization that did a lot of partnering with Mainstream. And I kept getting asked a lot of questions about how do we blend Indigenous views with Western views? And I always felt troubled by that question. And so I sat with her up at Six Nations and I asked her, I said, they keep asking me how to blend their ways with our ways. How do we do that? And she said, you don't. She said, we were not meant to take our ways and sort of meld them together. We were meant to operate side by side. The picture you're looking at is a quahog shell. And that was the shell often, but not always, chosen to create wampum. And wampum beads would be extracted from the shell using wooden dowels and other tools to create these tiny little beads that would be strung together, each representing something very important, representing an oral tradition, an oral recording. Earlier we saw documentation, we saw documents and agreements in a written form. For us, we communicated through storytelling, and oral tradition was recorded through wampum in many instances. And the wampum that I want to share with you in particular, as Yvonne shared it with me, is the Goswenta, the two-row wampum, otherwise known. This was created in the 1400s, and some say it's one of the oldest treaties in Canada. And it was meant to demonstrate how we were going to coexist. I think there came a time when, when the Haudenosaunee and the Dutch came together to realize, or come to the realization, we were going to have to find a way through coexistence. But how could we do that peacefully? How could we do that in a way of non-interference? And so the two-row wampum tells us, it's our instructions, it's our oral instructions recorded. This is a document. These two purple rows represent the rivers of life that are never ending. And in our canoe, we are traveling with our ways of knowing, being, seeing, and doing. And parallel to us, equal to us, are the settlers traveling in their ships with their ways of knowing, seeing, being, and doing. And together we're traveling side by side, equal and never interfering in another's way. And these principles, the white rows, represent peace, friendship, and respect. And these are the ways we were meant to operate for all time. So if you were to ask an elder from my community, my home community, you would probably discover that they believe that this is a forever binding agreement. And so sometimes you'll hear words like self-determination, inherent right, sovereignty. Essentially, I point it back to this in many ways, because we think about those intentions to travel those distinctive paths. We did not sign up for assimilation here in Canada. Taking us to today. There's my son. He's much older than that now, but he's also cheaper than stock photography, so you'll find him featured throughout this presentation. I want to play a quick audio clip for you. This comes to you from Professor Ryan DeCare. U of T had done a really tremendous campaign about a year ago, I believe. Can be found on TASC's website, in fact, if you're curious, and of course through U of T. But there's often, question about where did Toronto get its naming convention, and while it is debated, I want to play this clip and leave it to your own judgment. And here we go.
What does the word Toronto mean? It means that there's trees in the water. And to where that word comes from is disputed a little bit. Some people say it has to do with fishing weirs that were in the narrows between Lake Couchiching and Lake Simcoe a long time ago, but now it's kind of debated amongst their people. So Dzitkarunto, where the logs are in the water. People also say Aderunto. So you hear, depending on the speaker, a lot of people will say Dzitkarunto. Some people say Aderunto. Dzitkarunto, Aderunto.
Ontario.
Ganyadario, a beautiful or nice lake. And that's a word we've used for centuries, referring to the Lake Ontario. Yeah, Ganyadario, and that's not just a Mohawk word, it's an Iroquoian word. So any language of the Iroquoian family has a similar word for that, whether it be Huron, Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, or Tuscarora. We'll all say something similar to Ganyadario. You can hear it, Ganyadario in Ontario. Ganyatara on lake, and then the eo on the end is beautiful. Ganyadario. The language that we're speaking is Ganyageha, people of the Flint language or Mohawk language. Ganyageha.
And your people are called?
Ganyagehaga, the people of the Flint, or otherwise known as Mohawks. And we're part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, otherwise known as Haudenosaunee or Iroquois Confederacy.
Special thanks to Ryan DeCare for sharing part of his Ganyageha language. If you'd like more information, please follow us on Twitter, CKQ_U of T. What?
I'm sure that doesn't surprise a lot of you. In fact, a lot of naming conventions throughout Canada originate from Indigenous language descriptors and origins. Oftentimes were changed to match that of what the Anglo sort of view of the interpretation was. And so even if you look at old survey maps of the city of Toronto, you'll see that there's inconsistencies in the original spelling. Some spelled it T-A before it was T-O, and so. But the debate continues in terms of Toronto and its original naming convention. This is something I came across. I once worked for the government for 5 minutes, and I had come across this coat of arms pre-amalgamation prior to 1998. And what always struck me about it was that there was a visual representation of Indigenous folks, representing almost in that sort of same concept of the two-row, this equal partnership between Indigenous folks and city decision makers. And so under the Indigenous person, who looks like a very casual kind of Iroquois person, just chilling up, posted against this center crest piece, underneath him is the word industry. An industry we were, as my friends expressed so eloquently, that we were trade, hunting, fishing, trapping, planting. We knew the lay of the land and how to live within our means and resources and how to take care of the land in a way that I think benefited settlers in a lot of ways. Under the crest, you have the word intelligence, and then over here you have the very infamous image of Britannia holding her Triton and shield, looking very noble with the word integrity. The beaver in the basket likely representing, and this is my interpretation, the sharing equally of the bounty in the land and its resources. And then admittedly, I know nothing about the actual crest itself. Now, post-amalgamation, we were replaced by a beaver and a bear and a bird with the slogan, diversity, our strength. And perhaps rightfully so did we move to this slogan, diversity, our strength. Toronto is known to be, in fact, one of the most diverse cities in Canada, and perhaps even beyond. And so it totally makes sense that we needed to sort of modify this crest in light of the times. Where I always, I think, struggle as an Indigenous person is we are no longer visibly represented and presumed to be diversity. Just going to share with you some quick stats. StatsCan 2016 census says there's about 1.7 million of us here. That's not true. This is an undercount. It's always important to know that when you're looking at statistics, particularly ones produced by the federal government, or any government, that it may be a representation of an undercount because not all Indigenous people are comfortable or have trusting relationships with governments where they're willing to give up their information. So this would in fact be an undercount. I'd say a fairly significant one. This is a heat map recently produced by the City of Toronto, so I'm going to hail them up for this. This is really exciting. It's brand new, hot off the press. Also using some of the 2016 data to show a heat map of where we're physically located and living by postal code residents throughout the city. So the darker blue represents where we're evidently living. So a bunch of us are living in the sort of East York, Scarborough area, it looks like. Not entirely surprised there, but it's interesting to look at this because sometimes we're broken up as a city and decisions are often made by sort of wards or neighborhood clusters. That approach doesn't always work for us given sort of the fact that we're everywhere. The history of Indigenous social services here is a fairly long one, but I'll give you the 2-second version. There was a time, and I think Toronto, not unlike other major urban centers across the country and including in Ontario, the sector started with a need to provide a space to congregate. It started as a kitchen table and a coffee with your auntie or whomever. It was largely started on the premise of need for Indigenous folks who were leaving local reserves and First Nations and coming in from other areas to have a place to come together, because when you come to an urban area, you may not have access to your home reserve. It may not be within, you know, a 100K radius or more, depending on where you're from. We have a lot of local and neighboring First Nations, but we don't all have band membership necessarily to those. So it's super complex when you come into an urban space. I think it's really largely due to social services. that folks will have an opportunity to gather, come together in a good way. It was in the 50s that the Friendship Centre movement began here in Ontario with 6 centres, of course, one being here in Toronto. And again, in part to respond to the overwhelming migration to urban centres from local reserves primarily. In the 80s, Council Fire and the Native Canadian Centre were pretty much the 2 main organizations serving urban Indigenous people. And today we've grown to 24 plus urban Indigenous nonprofits. Now, when we say Indigenous nonprofits, of course, Toronto's home to thousands of nonprofits, but Indigenous led with Indigenous history in terms of their founders, we have about 24 at this point. There are a lot of other Indigenous organizations and entities, certainly beyond that, but as far as the primary social service and nonprofits go, there are 24. So going back again to Stats Can data, so in 2016, for the context of Toronto, they put us at around 46,000. Well Living House puts us at around 70 to 80,000. And that's double what I think Stats Can is estimating, and I tend to sort of believe that side of things. They had conducted a very full-scale research initiative with urban Indigenous folks back in 2015 or prior, and so their statistics, I think, better represent where we're likely currently at, and recognizing too that there is a high migration that, folks are coming in and out all the time. We have folks coming in from Ottawa who came from Nunavut based on their flight path. We have folks coming in from local First Nations and returning back and vis-a-vis all the time as well. So the number fluctuates most definitely, but I would say we're in and around that amount. A lot of the folks, and certainly not the whole 80,000, but I'd say, there are a fair number of us, like I said, who have at some point or another access to social service organization. And, when we think nonprofits, we often think, folks who are at a socioeconomic disadvantage or for some other reason. For many of us, it's not about income status or life status. It's about, again, access to culture. And so most all of these organizations, I think, tether us back to that thing that for a lot of us are seeking, particularly those of us who are disconnected or who lost that due to family history of 60 scoop or residential schools. And so these organizations become that sort of beacon of support. And you may recognize some of them by their logos that I'm showing here for the members of TASK and some non-members. So where are the Native serving agencies located? The urban Indigenous organizations are pretty much clustered in the downtown area. Maybe there was a good deal on real estate back in the day, I don't really know, but there's actually a few of them clustered so close together, you could throw a stone. That's how close they are, and you certainly could walk to most all of the bigger ones within probably 30, 45 minutes tops. As you can see, there's not a lot happening up in the north or out west near Etobicoke. In Scarborough, there's some services, but certainly not as many as I think are relative to the population of us that are living there. What are these organizations doing? I mean, they are doing that of, the sort of performative function of social services, and that they offer education, employment, other programs that are relevant to women, to spirits, and a whole host of other supports ranging from housing and houselessness to affordable housing advocacy and provision, and on it goes. I would say a large part of what the urban Indigenous organizations also convene to do at different tables and committees and through TASK is to plan, to do urban planning, to do social planning for a very large and diverse urban Indigenous population that, quite frankly, at times is not faring as well as other Torontonians. For instance, Well Living House in their our health counts data that I shared earlier in terms of population stats for Toronto, one of their findings also suggests that 90% of Indigenous folks are living below the low income cutoff, which then would suggest that if 90% of Indigenous families are living below the low income cutoff, then that means 90% of us are living in poverty, which to me is a citywide crisis that requires addressing. The Toronto Aboriginal Research Report was another piece of research that's really worth looking at. Please look it up if you don't already know it. For its time, it was the largest study ever conducted with and for urban Indigenous folks. It was commissioned by the agency that I work for. It surveyed 1,400 individuals across a variety of different topics using multiple methodologies. And it was really aiming at trying to understand what was the real-time snapshot of Toronto's urban Indigenous life experience here in Toronto. And three of the key themes that came out of this, and certainly not the only ones, but three of the really big emerging themes from that research report, which still remain really relevant today, even 10 years after the fact when this was created, are the pervasiveness of poverty, racism, and the continued visibility factor, which I think I shared with you when I talked about the city's crest. You know, visibility for Indigenous folks in a city as big as Toronto is something that we need to do better with, I think. I imagine a world where I can walk down the street with my kids and they can see themselves and the history and our enduring presence reflected here. I mean, maybe we should do like a really cool mural of my friends at the Mississaugas moving us Mohawks further out. I know that Darren is laughing right now. I hope he is anyway. There's a lot of work to be done, I think, also to not only bring visibility into the conversation, but to raise public awareness and education. I think that is so critical. You know, TRC call to action number 57 calls upon, you know, all levels of government to undertake cultural awareness training, but I believe that's, you know, all of society and all sectors of society to consider, because to know Indigenous folks, our plight, our history, our current context, our treaties, and all that there is to sort of, I mean, all the complexities for sure. It's a lot, and certainly it wasn't always taught in schools, or when folks were immigrating over here, it wasn't always part of the education curriculum. So there's a lot of work to do to unlearn and to relearn. In Indigenous contexts for urban, we have some complicated relationships with governments, because in a provincial or federal context, there is a duty to consult, there is a Crown to Indigenous relationship that occurs with First Nations governance structures, and hereditary ones to some degree. But I think for an Indigenous context, an urban municipality, it becomes really complex and laden with challenges in terms of how do we self-determine in an urban space like Toronto. And that's work that's happening currently, but I think it's happening with a lot of different folks and trying to figure out what it looks like. And so, you know, for a long time, I think we were lumped into notions of equity. I think more and more what we're hearing is the desire for self-determination. And I think self-determination, you know, to, again, my friends' points in their presentations, you know, they spoke about Section 35 and the recognition within our Constitution. We are, you know, the only ethno-specific group in Canada recognized in this way, and again, to that point of, you know, being a founding nation here in relation to Turtle Island and in context of North America, we are the first people of this land. So there are certain inherent rights to our own identities, languages, cultures, and lands that, again, were lost through history and present day colonization. I think, too, one way to sort of differentiate why some Indigenous people like myself don't see myself as equity, one, I'm Ongwe Hongwe, and I think as Ongwe Hongwe, there are different things that I might be seeking. For instance, I might be seeking, as an Indigenous woman, restoration of my culture, my language, and the right to understand and find those things, given that they were lost due to complex family history. For Indigenous people, Canada-wide, I mean worldwide, you know, we have the United Nations rights on, which has, you know, over 40 articles that make recognition for Indigenous people who have a history of colonization and the things that they are working toward. And these are the kinds of things that Indigenous folks are still fighting for in this day and age, in 2021. For instance, having to fight for clean drinking water within some spaces, including here in the South. Six Nations is, you know, it can be looked at as a very well-developed populous reserve. I know we have Tim Hortons and schools and policing and all kinds of infrastructure, but there are parts of the reserve where you still have to drive to get clean water. So it's not just relegated to the north, where in fact it is a very serious problem still in today. Human rights, our futures, our women, the safety of such, respect and dignity, and this list certainly goes on and on. I think when we achieve this list going down to nil and there's nothing left on it, be it equity, be it self-determination, I think we will have restored the thing we're trying to. I guess, too, this isn't about, you know, change making from this notion of like, how do we decolonize? I actually don't know the answer to how to decolonize anything. What I do know is that it's very simple in my mind. It's about changing systems, and to change a system, people's hearts and minds have to change. People, we have to change in order for systems to change, because we build the systems, we maintain the systems, and so if we are not willing to change ourselves in the way that we think and feel, about Indigenous folks, if we are not willing to seek out empathy and a greater understanding, then decision making will remain status quo. To achieve self-determination, what that looks like is Indigenous folks being able to author their own solutions, and including in urban areas where possible. It means increased visibility. It means that we are recognizing and paying respect to that truth and history. It's about creating space for the conversation, and it's about meaningful and willful engagement. So it's all or nothing. I can remember being contacted by a group a couple of years ago, and we get calls like this all the time, and they were talking about doing some social planning in a small town out near Picton. And I'd never heard from them, never met them before, but they wanted my advice on putting up a plaque to stand next to a Sir John A. statue, I guess. And anyway, my advice to them was to Google search within a 50K radius local First Nations or friendship centers to ask them, because I'm not from that territory and certainly it's not my place to speak on it. And of course, for their case, it would have been Tyendinaga for them to approach. And I hope that they did, but you know, important for us, it's let's do it really well right from the onset. And I want to sort of acknowledge them, because one of the things that they did do was try to involve Indigenous stakeholders and voices from the early onset of the thing they were trying to do. Conversely, sometimes we get calls where they're like, hey, we made a thing. What do you think of it? And it's like, well, I don't think anything of it. It's kind of too late. You've already made the thing. So it's important to call from the onset. It's also not a quick fix. I mean, we got here from generations and generations of this history that we have here, and it's going to take us more generations to come out of this and to heal as a nation, as a people. And so there's a lot of work to be done on both sides. It's also a multi-sectoral approach. Nonprofit's not going to work in a vacuum by itself. It's got to work with governments, private sector, and beyond. And I really do think that there's a real big push and need to move beyond the admiring of the problem to the action. I mean, Twitter is a great platform to sort of put out into the world intentions, but if they're just words and they don't translate into anything, I see that as problem admiring in some ways. And not to expect immediate results. Sometimes those results won't be seen, touched, or felt for, like I said, generations to come. And the tough one, it's about also being sometimes uncomfortable. And all sides will feel that in different ways. But as my former leader and boss that I worked for once upon a time, his favorite line for me was, I need you to be uncomfortable. And at the time, it drove me nuts. Why do I have to be uncomfortable to do my job? But it was years after that I came to the revelation that I did my best growing and my best work when I was uncomfortable. In terms of worldview, very quickly, because I recognize we're up on time, Indigenous and Western worlds have different views, as I shared earlier when I approached Yvonne with my question, how to blend the two, and she said you can't and you don't, but you could find a way to parallel them. In the German side of my family, I was taught, grow up, get a job, get an education, compete with everyone, and just get to that top of the food chain, that hierarchy. My father, who I spent a lot of time on the land with, was a much different thinker. Philosophically, didn't care much for material things, didn't care much for anything Western in truth. He was very much of the mind that you're only as great as you are if you are thinking about something that's bigger than yourself. And I didn't know what that meant at the time until I started this work. I mean, you don't get into social service work unless you're willing to be selfless and to give up something and to think more bigly about what your role and responsibility is and how it all interconnects and relates, and how to sort of respect all things in the context of who you are equal to those things. So the future, where to go? Local First Nations, like I shared with you in that example, Google within a 50K radius or 100K, wherever you are locating, First Nation, local First Nation or Friendship Center or Indigenous organization. Check out Indigenous events and powwows. Go to Indigenous communities and sectors beyond social services. There's other sectors, like I said, there's arts and business and more. Check out family, friends, and colleagues. I think, building networks takes time, but you'd be surprised how within your network, there may already exist opportunities for you. And the Google, absolutely the Google. My kids make fun of me because I call it the Google. What to do? Be explicit, be authentic, suspend judgment, practice acceptance, ask lots of questions. There are no bad questions. There's no need to be nervous or shy. We're humans, you're human. I have ears, you might also have ears. There are things I'm sure we have in common, so try to be relatable. I know there's sometimes this mysticism that folks think surround Indigenous people. I assure you, unlike what Disney says about Pocahontas, I cannot paint with the colors of the wind. Things to avoid, saying things like our Indigenous people or Canada's. This is this ownership piece that is really not relevant or empowering. Mispronounced land acknowledgements with nothing attached to them are not optimal either. Tokenism, buzzwords, having the answers or saving, also not helpful when building allyships with Indigenous communities. And at a very high level, and you cannot skip any steps, unfortunately, it's a big formula, but if you take all of these steps in the sort of chronology of them, you'll be, I think, very impressed and surprised with how far you can go. Engaging is first and foremost, building real relationships that are grounded in trust, respect, and reciprocity. Taking the time to do things like this, like education and understanding, it helps to evoke empathy and certainly a greater awareness. Doing that planning, going to that place of action, looking at your progress and impact and outcomes. I think, you know, to partner with an Indigenous group or collective or individual to work on a project, you're going into it with the aim of an outcome, something you can see, touch, and feel that's real. And so that's really the end goal, but all of these other steps are so critical to get to that place. And then more importantly, it's about sustainability, continuity planning, torch passing, and then repeat and reinvent and keep going, truly. And in the context of your work, I guess it's always having recognition for the honoring of historical significance, future impacts, local access and inclusion, carving out for ceremonial and cultural spaces, recognition and understanding of native plants, medicines, water care and ceremony, and a vision for restoration of land to Indigenous people. So that's the returning of land and the inclusion of us in land planning. And consulting with Indigenous organizations, residents, businesses, communities on developments and planning right from the onset. And I leave you with a quote of mine. It's not mine, actually, it's a favorite of mine, that we are not asking anyone to apologize for their ancestors, but rather to help us dismantle the systems of oppression that were built, that have been maintained and benefited from. Nyawa, thank you.
Thank you, Lindsay, for providing the urban Indigenous context tonight. To echo some of the comments we're receiving within the questions box, that was an outstanding presentation. People are so pleased, they learned so much, and they have a bunch of questions for you. Unfortunately, we only have a couple of minutes, so we'll share one now, and then I'll send some more to you later, and if you have time, you can answer them. So let's go with, apologies, I had a flag, but now I have to scroll up because so many are coming in. What is the main reason for the migration of Indigenous people not originating from these areas to the same urban areas?
It's a good question, probably distinct to each individual, but I would say probably a lot to do with infrastructure and access to things like transportation, food security, housing, economic opportunity that may or may not exist within certain reserve areas.
Thank you, and since that was a quick one, are there some social services organizations in Toronto that offer services in helping people with genealogy for people who have been detached from their Indigenous ancestry but feel uneasy about identifying as Indigenous without proof?
Not to my knowledge within the Indigenous social service sector specifically. There may be within the post-secondary realm. I would maybe check there. A lot of the post-secondary institutions have Indigenous student bodies and sort of centers by which you could maybe ask them. I'm not sure. I do know that some of the agencies do status card clinics for folks who do have access to that information. But by and large, I would say for genealogy, I've not heard of any, no. Okay. Thank you, Lindsay. Thanks again. That was excellent. And thank you everyone for all your questions. I wish we could get to them tonight, but we'll try and answer as many as you can. And if you have any other questions that you would like to ask following the webinar, please do email me and I will try and get it to someone who can answer your question. Okay, so with that, I guess it's time to wrap up our Lake Ontario evening. Thank you so much to our speakers.
thank you to everyone who joined us tonight. This is actually the most people we have ever had at a Lake Ontario evening, so we know this is an important topic, and it has come up again and again that this is stuff that needs to be taught in our schools and that we should be discussing and learning more about. We will be sending out a follow-up email that includes links to the organizations we spoke about tonight, the First Nations we spoke about tonight, as well as additional links on treaties and other information that you can look into. And we will again be holding other Lake Ontario evenings in the future. Our next one is going to be on eco-health, so the intersection between mental health, human well-being, and environmental health. Okay, so with that, we're going to adjourn. Thank you so much. Have a great night, everyone.